Well, here we are, and I'm going to call this video 1.5 great Oldsmobiles because the one in the front is, I would say, most certainly a great Oldsmobile. The one in the back, some things are great about it, but I don't know that I'd call it a great car overall. I enjoy driving it, though. So the frontmost car here, the car in the foreground, is my 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado, and the car in the background is my 1984 Oldsmobile Omega Brougham. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the similarities and differences between these. You say, similarities and differences between a Toronado and an Omega? Are you crazy? Sure, but I'm going to do it anyway because they're both front-wheel drive. That's a huge similarity. They're both Oldsmobiles. One is at the top of the lineup, the Toronado. The other, well, let's not say it's at the top of the lineup, but it wasn't the Forenza, and it's a Brougham, so why not? There's another comparison piece. This is a Brougham, and this is a Toronado Deluxe. So they both have the up-level interior. Ooh. But the 66 Toronado is one of these seminal cars in automotive history, and I think it's finally starting to get collectors appreciating it for what it is, a beautifully styled masterpiece. And the 66 is really the one to have because so much changed in 1967. The front end was slightly different. The fenders were all the same. The hood was the same. But it lost the eyebrows above the pop-up headlamps. This is the only Oldsmobile to date in 1966 that had pop-up headlamps. The only one that I can think of after this that had it was the 1986 Toronado when that came out, and for a few model years after that till that one ended its run. But 1966, you have the little eyebrows above the headlamps, which to me really helps accentuate the barbell theme, the thin in the middle, fat on the outer end. Some people call it the dog bone theme. Although the dog bone theme is a bit more pronounced, I would say that's more like the Mopars. And it helps with that theme, and you have some symmetry here between the eyebrow and then the this area down below the turn signal. So it's got this menacing face, and of course, this extremely sharp, something you can never do today, fender. And this bumper is even extremely sharp. So it's just amazing what they did. This has to be two pieces seamed together, I would guess, for that fender, because I don't know how else you could do that sharp of a piece of metal. This bumper must also be two pieces that's joined in the middle. In fact, you can kind of see that that's what that is. So this came out in 1966. The first generation Toronado came out in 1966, would run all the way through to the 1970 model year. It'd have exposed headlamps for 1970, the only model year of the first generation Toronado that would have that. This one has some options on the exterior that you'll notice, the polished wheels, that was not standard, and the cornering lamps that look like shark scales. So this Toronado was really, it's kind of an interesting car because it was at the top of Oldsmobile's lineup in this particular model year. And it wasn't really a sports car. It wasn't really a luxury car. It was kind of a personal luxury coupe and was carved out in the vein of the 1963 to 65 Riviera, which was kind of carved out in the vein of the 1958 Thunderbird when that went to be a four-place vehicle. And on the inside, I would say it's, well, so long as I open the door and unlock the door, it's just as cool as the outside, really. You have this driver's kind of, not oriented, but driver-themed cockpit, I'll call it, with the black. All the instrument panels on these Tornados were black, and you got this black floor mat that was integrated into the carpet. Obviously a perfectly flat floor because this is indeed front-wheel drive. This is the deluxe interior, has better door panels. You get the front and rear door handle on both sides so the rear passengers can get out. And you got some decent room back there, not necessarily great, but I love that the vinyl in this has like this iridescent color to it. It just looks great in the sun. Wow. Nice thick center armrest. And the doors on this actually close really nicely, amazingly. We'll get to the underhood department in a second, but the other thing I just want to point out from a styling perspective, and we're going to compare some of the styles and talk about this versus the Omega, Oldsmobile really after this point became known for very distinctive wheel arches and wheel-oriented shapes. And the Toronado, its seminal cue was really this surface that started up here, hopped over the wheel, continued down, hopped over the rear wheel. And the amazing thing about this car is you have to give a lot of credit not only to the designers but also the clay modelers who were somehow able to take a fender that stood perfectly vertical, and as it goes down the car it just rocks gradually inward to the point where back here, look at how big this particular flare is compared to the front. I mean, they're both big, but this one is even larger because now you got the C-pillar and the sail panel kind of tilting inward toward the roof. And now let's walk back toward the Omega. The Omega espoused some of these Oldsmobile design elements, most particularly these wheel-oriented shapes. And I would say that of the X cars, the Omega had really the most complicated with this fillet and then the radius here. And believe it or not, I can't believe this is true, but all these fenders are different on the X cars if you look at them. The cars have different fenders, they have different quarters, they have different deck lids. And unfortunately, GM just got no credit for the fact that all that sheet metal was unique because I think that the car didn't have a lot of real estate. It was so much smaller than the Toronado in front of it, but it had a lot of unique sheet metal. And that was a lesson that GM learned by the time the W cars, the coupes came out in 1988. They actually gave them different roof lines, the Cutlass Supreme, the Regal, and the Grand Prix, so that they didn't all look alike. But in fact, the Toronado, as an example, shares its roof panel, shares its backlight, shares the side glass, the A-pillars, and the windshield with the Riviera. Now, would you ever suspect that this car has all of this the same? It even has this crease on it on the Riviera too. But the quarter and the roof are kind of separated in this area. The Toronado kind of curves, and then this sail panel curves and goes into the belt. And then the Riviera, as opposed to having this huge flare, has a whole nother surface on the rear quarter. But you would never again guess that they shared so much, because I think there's just far more real estate here. And the fact that the roof line is the same, the rear end is so different on these cars. If you look at the Riviera, it's got the W-shaped rear, and here the Toronado just has this chopped off rear end, and of course it has a very distinctive front. Whereas the X cars all kind of shared this very similar proportion, the 3-box design with the chopped off rear and a relatively blunt front end as well. Some of that chopped off rear profile was because they're trying to get appropriate trunk volume in these cars, and so it was hard to have, like the Toronado has. That car actually, I would say the Omega has a bigger trunk than the Toronado. But in order to get the trunk volume, you have to have this relatively upright trunk area, and you want the deck lid to extend all the way out so you get more space. If it were sloped, well, that's going to create a potential issue. Now, of course, one of the things that you do have that's similar but different. Remember the barbell theme on the Toronado in the front? Here you've got the inverted, I'll call it barbell. You've got, it's skinnier on the outer ends and fat in the middle. Just something to give the hood a little bit of dimension. This is almost kind of old school style GM design. You'd notice a lot of the 70s era cars in particular, they'd have high fenders that would then dip down. You'd have the so-called catwalk area. You'd have a crease that was coming, out on the hood, particularly the Pontiacs, to form a V shape. Even the Cadillacs, it was a V shape, but the shoulders were wider. And then you'd have another fender peak. Well, here the designers kind of emulated that to some degree, but the fender peaks are very, very muted, and I suspect that's because the designers were really trying to make the car look wider than it is. If you had this fender peak and then you had another shoulder and this hood had a lot of ins and outs in terms of the kinks in the sheet metal, you wouldn't visually have this flat surface, which lends this air of, I'll say, width to a car that really doesn't have much width. These cars are quite narrow, in fact. And you do have some beautiful details. You have this little filleted surface here that's relatively pronounced at the front of the car that just gradually fades out, and by the time it reaches the A-pillar, it's gone. So these X cars do have some really nice surfacing in them. And on a sunny day like this is a dark maple red metallic paint that unfortunately has suffered from GM's 80s era paint where there's crazing on it. Amazingly, it's still pretty much holding together. And it looks really, really nice in the sunlight where you pick up this low light and you have the highlight here. Just detail I don't think you see all that much on cars today. Mark, my friend, would say this car throws shadows on itself. It doesn't really on the body side, pretty simple body side, but it does in some other areas. And amazingly, I don't know who from the General Motors engineering team thought that this was a good idea, but look at all these different surfaces you had to mate up in this area here between the A-pillar, the fender, the door, this panel up front. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these panels, all trying to get them aligned. Boy, that must have driven the folks in the factory absolutely nuts. Now, the cool thing is you have this filleted surface that really, as I mentioned, fades out here. And you've got a similar thing on the quarter where it fades out and then becomes more pronounced and it continues back. And then notice it's relatively flat here. And then all of a sudden you have a surface that develops out in the back of this car. So some really nice design elements despite the fact that these all looked alike. Now, in terms of the similarities, this was something that, the Toronado was designed before Oldsmobile went to the split grille theme, which would come about in 1968. And so for the 1967 Toronado, you have this kind of linear, very thin bladed grille up front. And Oldsmobile in 1968 would introduce its split grille that it would continue really not through the end of the run, but for many, many years, and the Omega here has it. I actually like the earlier Omegas, the 1980 as an example, when it came out, it had the waterfall grille, which had even more Oldsmobile heritage. That waterfall grille was something that was very prominent on the 1976 and 77 Cutlass, and if you haven't seen it, take a look at my channel for the interview with Len Casillo, who was the chief designer on that 76 to 77 Cutlass, for more about that waterfall grille. Here, they started to go away from it, and I think that's a little bit of a shame because the front end looks a bit more plain without that waterfall grille. Now, I paused the camera to pop the hood because this is where the similarities and differences are pretty stark. They are both front-wheel drive vehicles, but the Toronado has a longitudinally mounted engine, and then you have the turbo-hydromatic 425 transmission, which has its torque converter that comes off of the engine. Then there's a Morse high-vo chain, which then drives the transmission, which is pointing this way, and then drives these beefy half shafts through the final drive setup. This is a 425 cubic inch Oldsmobile V8 making 385 horsepower. That is gross horsepower. Net horsepower, probably 270. It's not overly fast, but it's pretty peppy. And you have the cool dual snorkel air cleaner on this Toronado. I think it's one of the coolest Oldsmobile air cleaners. And you have kind of this sunken intake manifold, which is not great for performance, but I suspect because of the relatively low height of the hood that the engineers had to have that kind of a low-rise intake manifold to have the air cleaner clear without having some funky air cleaner that was off to the side like Chrysler had in the 1950s or Studebaker on their 1953 cars. And you have kind of the old school distributor points set up and the transmission kickdown switch there for the turbo-hydromatic 425. So good old school power. As we go back to the Omega, you've got the very powerful Iron Duke 4-cylinder engine that makes 92 horsepower. And the amazing thing about this is it is front-wheel drive, just like I said, just like the Toronado, but this is obviously transversely mounted. And the Iron Duke did have the same bore and stroke as the Pontiac 301 cubic inch V8. It's not half a V8, but it did have the same bore and stroke, as I mentioned. And it was engineered by Pontiac division. So back in the day, when you got an Oldsmobile engine. Now you got a Pontiac 4-cylinder in your Oldsmobile or optional Chevrolet sourced V6 engine. The one great thing about this, I will say, is it's very easy to service the thermostat. You just take that cap off there and pull the thermostat right out. It's got to be the easiest thermostat I've ever serviced. No gasket, no nothing. And you do have this huge pancake-style R4 air conditioning compressor. The air conditioning in this car is freezing cold. I think the AC evaporator and compressor is just hugely overspec. This is the same compressor that was used on the full-size cars. I don't know if it says what the amount of charges that it takes. It just says refrigerant oil. I can't quite see how much R12 it takes. But in any case, trust me, it's very, very, very cold. This one's been converted to R134A, and it still freezes you out. And for those who don't know, on these X cars and some of the other GM front-wheel drive vehicles there, you have the prop rod. This is the normal position when you prop the hood. But this is the service position. Just put the rod in there, and then you've got this vertical hood. So it makes it a lot easier. This one's hard. Many people don't know that this does have a distributor. When I bought this car, it didn't run that well. Somebody had done a tune-up and put newer wires on it and new spark plugs. But the distributor cap and the rotor were original. I don't think they knew that it had a distributor cap and rotor, and then the backside there. And it's really tight to get in there. What you really have to do is undo that dog bone mount and then kind of rock the engine forward a little bit, and that makes it a lot easier to get to the distributor on these. It's the best way I found to do it. You do have, as I mentioned, this is a transversely mounted engine transmission. You've got the turbohydromatic 125C transmission here that is coupled to the edge of the engine. One thing that is great about this car versus that one, I would say, what do I get in terms of gas mileage on this one? 12 to 15, depending on how I'm driving it. Around town on a cold day, maybe 9 to 10. This one on the freeway, I'll get 31, 32 miles per gallon. It's actually very fuel efficient. And unfortunately, though, it's a very buzzy engine because there's no balance shaft. The balance shaft in the Iron Duke wouldn't come until 1988. So this 1984 model doesn't have the serpentine belt, which would arrive for 1987. Doesn't have the balance shaft, which would arrive for 1988. Does not have crank triggered ignition, which would also arrive for 1987. And christening this four-cylinder the so-called Tech 4, even though Car and Driver ridiculed it as the low Tech 4 because it's just a basic overhead valve, crude, but reliable, generally very reliable four-cylinder engine. So you do have another similarity here from a design standpoint. You have in the Toronado the chopped off back. You have the chopped off back on this Omega 2 for different reasons. As I mentioned, this was principally because of trunk volume requirements. The Toronado was because designers were looking for something that was different from the Riviera sister car. The Eldorado was the other car that was on this platform. The Eldorado did share the front glass, the front windshield, the A-pillars, but the roof panel was different on the Eldorado, and the C-pillar is different. It's a very formal style C-pillar as opposed to this kind of fastback two-box design that you see on the Toronado. I will say that if you compare the interior room, it kind of feels similar. This Toronado, when you're in the front seat, it feels good. It's kind of a close coupled back rear seat. And the Omega, despite its somewhat diminutive size, I gotta give the packaging engineers credit in this car and the ergonomists because it feels big in the front seat. The dash is pushed far forward aside from the instrument cluster binnacle that's pulled back so you can see the gauges better. But notice how far that's pushed forward ahead of the passenger compartment so that you have this feeling of openness and airiness. And these seats, the seat designer, they may not look it, but these are some of the most comfortable seats I've ever sat in any car. And it's a bench seat. This is actually not buckets. These are not individually adjustable. The whole seat moves This is only a 5-passenger car, and so they purposely made it uncomfortable to somebody to try to sit there in case they did try to do so. The A cars would be 6-passenger cars, but this bench seat is just amazingly comfortable in this Omega. Now the back seat, if I open the door, let's see if the power door locks work. It did. Now the front seat is all the way back, and it's pretty tight back here with the front seat all the way back. These seats are very thick. The foam padding is thick. This is a great road trip car between the gas mileage, and it's pretty quiet on the inside on the freeway. No wind noise, not a lot of road noise. GM did a lot right with these X cars. Of course, they did have braking issues in the early years, and they had steering rack issues, some window regulator issues, kind of the typical 80s era GM car issues. But even the back seat, if you just pull this front seat up a little bit, is quite comfortable. And, you know, something that I would say is more comfortable than the Toronado even. Ooh, Brome. Very nice. And one thing that is different too, both these cars have crank windows, but I don't know why in the X cars, to roll the window down, you go counterclockwise as opposed to clockwise. It's the only GM in the 1980s, it's the only cars that I can think of that really did this. But again, a very comfortable place to be. And I guess another similarity, you do get the Rocket logo. This is a restyle of the Rocket logo that was used on the Toronado, which interestingly was a copy of the Lincoln logo. Oldsmobile designers kind of copied that, and you can see it in there. It has a little bit of that Lincoln shape, probably more so if you look up here at this. This is a lot more Lincoln-like. We'll close the hood up, at least on the Autumn Bronze Toronado, and hopefully you enjoyed that. Unfortunately, I can't take the cars for a drive, as I mentioned, because the salt's still on the roads. But at least you get a little hint of spring coming. Thank goodness it's getting to March. What a cold winter in the Midwest. Awful winter. One of the worst winters that I can remember in over a decade. I guess if you're a skier and you like winter sports, maybe it was good, but it wasn't necessarily my favorite. Hope you enjoyed this fun little comparison. And yes, I know people are going to make fun of my little Omega. You know what? I love it. I paid $2,000 for this car, and it had 14,000 miles on it when I bought it. I think it's got about 17,000 now. I actually really like driving it, despite the puttering Iron Duke and people thinking it's just a crappy car. You know what? It's a perfect example of if you enjoy it and it makes you happy, just do it. This car actually has 13-inch tires, by the way, too, which is kind of humorous. It's still the original tires, which are in good shape. The original Uniroyal Tiger Paws. It's hard to get 13-inch tires. 185/80 R13. Yikes. I think the designers of the Toronado probably thought that these were relatively small wheels in their 15s. A lot of cars during the mid-60s, even my full-size 67 Olds Delta 88 has 14-inch wheels. So the designers did at least get 15s on the Toronado, but 13s if you were an Omega buyer. Thanks again for watching.